This type of methodology is best explained through a brief a participatory demonstration. So what I'd like you to do, I'd like everyone to actually play this game. Now, I don't have a way to measure it, but this will help you understand how we measure these type of implicit biases and what the consequences are. So this is Ohio. How many of you have real weapons with you right now? Are people required to answer that question? Okay. If you have a real weapon, concealed or not, please do not use it. Today, our weapons will be our fingers. Okay, so this is how it's going to work. Everyone's got a gun, everyone's got a trigger finger, and everyone's got a safety button. Our safety button is just these beautiful desks in front of you, okay? So trigger, safety. Here's the simple rule. When you see a man holding a gun, you shoot as fast as you can. When you see a man holding an object like an old school cell phone, you hit the safety as fast as you can, okay? Simple rule. I'm only gonna give you 3 chances. All right, everyone have their guns? Okay, can you guys see this? Okay. Am I blocking anyone's view? No. Okay, here we go. That was kind of slow, but you need practice. I knew you were going to be too slow already. Okay, ready? One more. Oh, dang. Okay, most of you, good shot. Just one more chance, all right? One more chance. Raise your guns. Here we go. How many of you shot a good guy right there? All right. So, let's take a look at what happens when you run this study on thousands and thousands of people. Here's what happens consistently, okay? This slide shows you reaction time in milliseconds. So we can measure in milliseconds how quickly people pull the trigger, how quickly they hit the safety, and also, of course, how many people mess up, the error rate, okay? So this graph is only the reaction time in shooting armed people and hitting the safety. First interesting thing to note, people are faster to shoot than they are to hit the safety, right? It's easier for us to perceive a weapon and shoot than it is for us to realize it's not a weapon. That's kind of an interesting phenomenon. But that's not why I'm here today. I'm here to talk about the racial aspects. People are faster to shoot black men with guns than white men with guns. People are faster to hit the safety with white men holding cell phones than black men holding cell phones. This is true for police officers who take this test as well. What about this? Error rates. How many times do people hit the safety when the man is holding the gun? Well, the error rate is quite low when a black man holds a gun, right? Not too many people hit the safety. But when it's a white man holding a gun, it's almost double the amount of people hit the safety. But look what happens with the cell phone. And we know of real world instances where people have been shot reaching for a wallet or a cell phone, right? The error rate is much higher. People are more likely to shoot an unarmed black man. Police, incidentally, when they take this test, are actually better on the error rate than the rest of the population, but in the reaction time, they still show strong racial biases. So that's one type of measure. How many of you have taken an implicit association test? All right, so about 5 of you. It's worth showing you what this is. This is probably the most well-known measure of implicit bias. It also uses reaction time in milliseconds. The reason it does this is because if you're measuring non-conscious automatic attitudes, you have to pick something that's hard to control. And speed is very hard to control. So participants are told, group together concepts, usually words and pictures, as fast as you can. Okay, so this is how it works. This is the classic example. First, you learn how to go. You either hit a key on the left side of your keyboard or the right side of the keyboard. So a word will pop up. Okay, lazy is negative, so you'd hit left side, right? And then you learn that for a while and you see the different stimuli. Then you see photos and you do the same thing, left side, right? Then this is where the measurement really starts, when you have to group together the categories. So in this situation, negative words or photos of African Americans, you hit the left side of your screen, of your keyboard, opposite for the right. So here we go, right, see, left. Okay, then, and this is the important part, see how the categories have changed? We do the same thing, and we measure reaction times, and then we compare. Is it easier for people to group together negative and African American, positive European American, or this screen, right? And this is where we find that 90% of people have a much easier time grouping together positive concepts with white, negative concepts with black. If this was just a video game and it didn't mean anything in the world, it might be less important. But when you look at what the results of these tests predict, it gets to be pretty concerning. So what do we care about? Jobs, healthcare. Right? We've done studies on this. So economic allocations. This was a student study, but it's an interesting study. They tested students by telling students of a budget crisis, which I think is quite believable. And the students were asked to help the administration decide how to cut funds across student organizations, like BALSA. And then they did that measure. They separately tested the same students' implicit bias levels. And what they found was that implicit bias levels of the students predicted where they cut money. So people who had highest implicit biases against black students, Jewish students, and Asian students cut funds from the organizations that represented those groups. What about medicine? We're walking distance from the world-famous Cleveland Clinic Heart Center. What happens when someone appears at the emergency room in this country suffering from heart attack-like symptoms? We don't hope that the treatment will be based upon implicit perceptions, but a study of actual ER doctors found that implicit bias levels relating to black patients predicted whether the doctors prescribed the preferred clot-busting medication or less preferred methods. Jobs. There's been studies in the U.S. on the effect of names and jobs, and it's been found that African American sounding names basically are treated as having the equivalent of 8 years less experience than white sounding names. A study in Europe has connected that directly to implicit bias levels. In that case, they studied in Europe the effect of Arab Muslim names in Sweden and found the same thing. So across society, we have a lot of reason to be concerned about implicit bias today. In the legal system, we do too, and I only have a few minutes to show you 3 short examples of the kind of research that we're doing. These are my projects that I've been working on in the criminal justice setting. Take a look at these slides that were shown to people. I'm going to give you just 2 seconds each. So they were told about a crime, a robbery. Okay, so we use mock jurors for this trial. We showed them those photos and we asked them to help us understand how they thought about different pieces of evidence that were presented at the trial. A good example is the defendant used to work at this particular mini mart. That could cut both ways. That could lead to a mistaken identification, or it could be an indicator that the person knew when and how to rob the place, right? So somewhat ambiguous facts. And here's what we tested. Is that the same picture? What's different? Skin tone, right? So half the people saw the lighter color, half the people saw the darker color skin tone, and that's the only thing that was changed. 4 seconds. Well, what we found was simply doing that affected, in particular, ratings of the evidence. So when we just said someone was arrested for the crime, we want you to rate the evidence. People who had seen the darker skinned suspect rated the same evidence as being more probative of guilt, more indicative of guilt. Another thing we've done just to get through this so you can see, we created a guilty, not guilty implicit association test to see whether people implicitly associate race and important legal concepts connected to the presumption of innocence. In our society, we certainly wouldn't want to have implicit associations between race and guilt that would affect our presumption of innocence. But unfortunately, when we run this study, we find significant differences in that people implicitly associate white with not guilty and black with guilty. So then there's one last study that we've recently done and we'll follow up. This study, we had a federal judge come in and we recorded him reading jury instructions. And we brought participants into our moot court room, which is, it looks like that, kind of like this room, except for we had a Lido sitting in there. And we put the mock jurors in the jury box, and we put a video screen in front of them, and we asked them to listen to the jury instructions. We told them about the trial. Half the jurors received a jury instruction that included presumption of innocence, and the other half received jury instructions without it, but with similar length instructions. So we then conducted the following measure. I'm going to ask you to try to, I don't know how well it's going to show up on the screen, but try to identify on the screen. We're going to show you two faces that flash, and then a dot's going to appear, okay? Try to tell me as fast, or try to recognize as fast as you can where the dot is, all right? Can you see that, or is it too faint? Okay, you can see it, good. So this is called the dot probe task, okay? This measures visual attention. And basically you can tell where people were visually looking based upon their reaction time. If they're looking on the side that has the dot, they're going to see it faster. And this method's been verified. What we found was that people who had received the presumption of innocence instructions were looking at the black man's face. And here's the graph. PI is the presumption of innocence. So if there was no presumption of innocence instructions, there was no real difference between where people were looking. But when people heard the presumption of innocence instruction, they were more likely to be looking at the black man's face. So why is that? Is that because people, even though on the other test, people implicitly associated white with not guilty, is it that the presumption of innocence is causing people to think about innocent black men? I don't think so. We know that if you run the same study, but you prime people with crime, so you tell them about crime, and then you run the same study, people are looking at the black man's face. We know that if you prime people with black faces, and then you show them pictures of weapons that slowly come into focus, they can identify the weapons faster when they see black faces. We know that people implicitly associate black with guilty on the implicit association test. So our interpretation of this, when we'll follow up, is that the presumption of innocence has been corrupted, perhaps by the media or our culture. So this is the kind of work we're doing in the modern world with implicit bias on injustice, and it's just a small sample, but something I wanted to share with you. We don't have time to talk about debiasing now, but it does raise important questions about what this means about our society, right? How do we think about this concept that we all hold this, right? Is it just some glitch that we shouldn't feel responsible for, or is this a meaningful reflection of something flawed in our society that continues to propagate inequality? And because of that, what do we do about it? And there's a lot of research going on about debiasing, which I'll skip for now, but you can just take a quick look at the slides. And I want to thank you.
Do it like this?
I think that might work.
I think it's big.
It'll do under view. It'll do full screen.
Okay.
Full screen mode. Perfect. Awesome. That's
Okay, there we go.
Thanks. How are you? So I'm going to talk about disparities, particularly in the criminal justice system, picking up on sort of where Justin took us a few minutes ago. And one of the defining features of the criminal justice system, other than the fact that we incarcerate lots of people, right, more per capita than any other country on earth, is that we have persistent racial disparities in the criminal justice system. And we can talk about these disparities in a number of different ways, but one of the most salient ways to do that is to focus on what happens at the end of the system when we incarcerate people. And so Black Americans constitute about 12 to 13% of the population in the United States, but they represent almost a third of the people that are locked up in our nation's prisons and jails. Right? And so there have been three traditional explanations that people use to talk about these disparities. The first is that we have disparities, but they're justified rather than unjustified disparities. And this argument goes that the reason why there are more Black Americans in prisons and jails is because Black Americans commit more crime. And there are kernels of truth in this, right? When we talk about violent crime, particularly homicides, you see a lot of disparity, right? But not all of it's explained. There are still significant residual unjustified disparities. And when you move away from the most serious violent crimes and you move especially towards drug crimes, the usage of drug crime in this country is about even between Black and white Americans, but the number of incarcerations for Black Americans is incredibly disproportionate, right? So we have the justified disparity explanation doesn't get us very far, right? Or gets us. The second disparity is known as historic or institutional racism. The idea is we had formal discrimination as the law in this country for so long, right, that today what we see with race disparities in prisons is not so much racism for racism, it just phenotype based on your skin color, but because of formal discrimination, we have these disparities in society. We have educational disparities, employment disparities, just generally concentrated disparities in poverty in this country. And therefore, because of that formal legacy, we're left with today a system that looks like it does. Right? A third big explanation is really different. Right? And this has been an explanation that's been popularized by Ohio State law professor Michelle Alexander. I'm not sure if you're familiar with her or not, but the idea is that we no longer have formal discrimination. We no longer have formal Jim Crow, right? But maybe the system today, because we have so many disparities, especially with drugs, maybe the system today isn't accidental, right? And it's not just an historical legacy, but it's a new way of social control, a new way of institutionally controlling Black Americans. And the problem with this explanation is, although it's hard to think of our friends and our neighbors, right, prosecutors, police officers, and others sort of concentrating and purposely creating this system that we have today. So again, all these explanations have seeds of truth, but they don't get us all the way there. And over the last 10 or 15 years, scholars have begun to talk about implicit race bias in the criminal justice system. And Justin used this picture already, so I won't spend much time on it, but the idea with the implicit biases is we have so much information coming in, but we need to categorize it somehow without consciously thinking about it. And so you see that object, you don't spend a lot of time on it, you just sit down, right? But the problem is those associations aren't always so innocuous, right? And so when we see Black Americans, people associate, using the implicit association test that Justin showed you, Black Americans with violence, with hostility, with criminality, and especially with drug use. Right? But I want to focus on one particular, use one particular association between Black Americans and weapons and show you how these tests are done on the implicit association test and then also with a priming technique, right? And then with the shooter bias study. So across a couple different methodologies. So the first is the implicit association test. This should look familiar. We just covered it a little while ago. And it turns out when you see Black Americans are much stronger association between Black Americans and weapons than white Americans and weapons, right? When you look at a priming study, and Justin covered this quickly at the end, but the way priming studies work, right, is you see
a consciously imperceptible face, right? It's flashed for milliseconds. And so you never realize that you've seen the face. And you either see a white face, a black face, or we have a control group, which is you get no prime at all, right? And then you see an image that's very degraded, and it comes into focus over a number of frames, about 46 frames. And it turns out that when you're primed with a black face, you're much quicker to identify the weapon, right? At the object as a weapon, than when you're primed with a white face or with no face at all. And then again, the shooter bias test, you're much, again, more quickly to shoot someone and to incorrectly shoot somebody when it's a black person than when it's a white person, right? So you can think about how we have these associations through the implicit association test and priming between black and weapons, and it helps to contextualize a little bit how we end up with a shooter bias that has the results that it does, heavily disadvantaging black Americans. And so these associations between black Americans and negative aspects, right, have got a lot of coverage in the automatic negative stereotypes. Have got a lot of coverage in law reviews. We talk about it in terms of traffic stops and the way police officers use force, the way people remember evidence in the Justin study that he talked about, the way you think about dangerousness when you're talking about the death penalty. Is somebody going to be a danger in the future, right? And so you can think about the way we talk about implicit bias as outgroup derogation. It used to be we had formal, explicit negative stereotypes. It was explicit, people would just tell you them, right? And that's largely gone away for a lot of the population. But now what we see is this explicit sort of automatic negative stereotypes. And so Justin and I have been doing some work with another person, Zoe Robinson, and we want to show sort of the second half of the story, right? A part of the story we think complements this automatic negative stereotyping story, and that's the story of implicit favoritism. And the idea here is that we treat race when it's white, when the person's white, as almost like it is a control group, or it's a neutral, that race, that whiteness has no inherent qualities to it, right? And so think about a traffic stop. When we talk about, well, did you see a black person go by and then the police officer stopped him, or was it a white person that went by? But pretend the police officer saw nobody, right? The car went by and you can't tell whether it was a white person or a black person, right? So think of that as your control. Would the police officer be more likely to stop the car if the person was black versus they didn't see the car, or if the person was white versus they didn't see the car, right? And we think that if you see the white person, right, the police officers are less likely to stop the car than if you didn't see the person at all. We think there's something about whiteness that gives you a benefit. And so when we talked about the shooter bias study, remember I told you there was a neutral category, right? We had no prime at all. So you just saw no face. And it turns out that when you're shown a white face instead of no prime, people are slower to identify the weapon. It takes more frames than when they had no prime at all, right? So it shows an active disassociation between the idea of whites and weapons. In memory studies where you have a fact pattern of a violent altercation and then you distract somebody, right? And after you distract somebody, you ask them questions about the scenario, what just happened in the fact pattern. It turns out that when it's a white defendant, people just sort of make up things that aren't there that are mitigating, right? You remember mitigating facts, or remember the story in ways that sort of is helpful or mitigates the story if it's a white defendant, in the same way that when it's a black defendant, you make up facts that sort of like aggravate the crime, ambiguous facts, right? And the idea here is, again, that we fill in the gaps. We know so much, we put it into schemas because we can't control of it, and we fill in the gaps in ways that are consistent with stereotypes, right? I think this is the most disturbing example. So there are pain studies, and what happens is you see either a white person or a black person, and you have a Q-tip, somebody's rubbing a Q-tip, and when you rub a Q-tip, probably no surprise, the association of areas in your brain that's called the pain matrix doesn't really activate when you're rubbing a Q-tip, right, on anybody's hand. But when you instead of a Q-tip, if you take a needle and you stick the needle in the hand, the pain metrics goes crazy, right? When you're an in-group member, a white person watching another white person, right? When you're watching a black person, it depends on the study, it depends on the person, but the activity is almost always diminished when you're a white person watching a black person, right? Sometimes it's almost like you're using the Q-tip. Sometimes they show, in some studies, no activation of the pain metrics at all. So we talked about a couple, we can't go through, but these are just a couple of phenomena. We also have things like stereotype boost and stereotype lift, the idea of the ultimate attribution error. We talked about the memory and the in-group studies and primary. So there are a number of areas where you see this sort of what we've called implicit white favoritism. But I want to talk about just two examples from the criminal justice system before we finish. The first is, how many of you are familiar with the case Graham versus Florida? In Graham versus Florida, the Supreme Court held, and this is just a few years ago, that for a juvenile who commits a non-homicide offense, a juvenile who commits any offense that doesn't result in death, you cannot sentence that juvenile to life without the possibility of parole. And the court said the reason why you cannot sentence the person to life without the possibility of parole is because juveniles aren't fully formed yet, right? Their brains don't work the way that adults do. They don't have the same stable identities. They're much more susceptible to outside influence, peer pressure, situational forces. And so all of those things, the court said, lead to an inability to conclude at the onset, at the point where the crime was committed, that somebody is irreparably irredeemable. Somebody cannot be fixed. Somebody's not suitable to re-enter into society. And so we have to give juveniles who commit non-homicide offenses a chance at redemption, right? A chance that they will become a different person in 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 years than they were when they were 15 or 16 or 17 and committed a terrible crime. So I want you to think about 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 years later, the people who make the decisions about whether somebody has changed, right? And I told you that we didn't talk about the ultimate attribution error, but I'm going to give you a quick rundown so we can talk about it in this context. The ultimate attribution error says when you're talking about an in-group member, and so here we're talking about race, right? So we're talking about white Americans and black Americans. When you're talking about an in-group member and somebody's done something bad, right? Something wrong, something bad, and it's a white person talking about another white person, we tend to make explanations up that take account of situational factors. They were young, they were on drugs, they were tired, they were whatever it is, you make up factors that are about the situation. It's not the person, right? But when you have an out-group member, so here a white person looking at a black American, you make the explanations you give are about that person. They're dispositional. This is not a young person or somebody who was on drugs or somebody who had a bad peer network. This is a bad apple, right? And so think about that in the context of white favoritism when you're making this determination later. When you have to think about something as amorphous bias,